Okay, so dobrý večer. I will talk in English because it's easier. You have your translation if you want. So I just jump right into the debate and introduce very shortly my guests. I'm very happy that wow, this is a combination which is a dream team. First of all, Masha Gessen, the writer for New Yorker, but 10 other best journals and media in the world. Born in Russia, living now in the US, an excellent author of many books. The book, last one, or almost last one, The Future is History, about Russia, how is past and the present, how Russia is actually dependent on its brutal past. Ivan Krastev, very well known, as you probably, I don't need very much to introduce. His books like After Europe or the last one, The Light Which, failed, with his colleague Stephen Holmes about Europe, and 89 and the legacy of that. And finally, David Graeber, who is, how to say, anthropologist, one of the most influential, intellectual, radical thinker, the author of books like Depth, First 5,000 Years, which was translated, I think, in Czech. One of the and Slovak, one of the best book, inspired me very much. The book, another one, Bullshit Jobs. First of all, yeah, you can, to be short, these three people are, the best of the best in the world intellectual elite. In my personal list, they are in my top 10. So it's my honor to be here with them. And I start directly because we have not much time. So first of all, today there were two demonstrations, one by politicians, one organized by Decent Slovakia. Chris already spoke about that. Yesterday in Prague was 300,000 people in the Letna, but there were all around the world demonstrations, huge demonstrations of people, you name it, Chile, Hong Kong, Lebanon, Egypt. It's just there are more and more. So my first question is, what's going on? Is this some new phenomenon? What the people are demonstrating for? Are these people demonstrating for the same thing or different ones? Is it some of them are violent, some of them are peaceful? What is this? What is this, David?
Oh, well, it's actually quite remarkable because what's happening around the world, for some months, nobody even noticed. There were things happening in Haiti, there were things happening in Costa Rica, there were things happening in Southeast Asia, and so many that it was unprecedented. And now that we have really, really large ones in places where it can't help but catch people's attention, such as Chile, where the government has actually now conceded and has agreed, I just learned today, to create a new constitution. Places like Lebanon, Iraq. I think that there is a general feeling that the kind of democratic processes, promises that were made 30 years ago were never fulfilled. And that if we don't actually start doing some of the things that people imagined were going to happen then, we're going to end up with fascism. I think people were really alarmed by that prospect.
Ivan?
I see, probably wrongly, but 4 factors playing it here. One is just internationalization of politics. If you want to be noticed, go on the street. In a certain way, basically, who is interested what's going to be the elections here and there? If you want to understand that your country has a problem and you want to make something, go on the street. Secondly, people do not want to be represented anymore. They don't trust political leaders. And from this point of view, you're ready to go on the streets, to walk for a long time, but you're not ready basically to give a trust to leaders because you're afraid that you're going to be cheated. The third thing, in my view, has something to do with the generational issue, particularly in Europe, which I know better. And the story is that young generation is a small cohort. You cannot make a difference on the ballot box. You don't have the numbers. And as a result of it, if you're a young person and basically wants to show your level of politicization, it's very much on the street. In Bulgaria, we had 2013, there was a mass political protests, and one of the demand was for new elections, but 70% of the people on the street said that they're not going to vote on them because they have nobody to vote for. So from this point of view, there is something about this. And the fourth thing, of course, is new technologies. If you see, before, when you see people on the street, you basically know who is on the street. The revolution used to have ideological names. Now, basically, if you see even when people talk about Twitter revolution or this or that, it's much more company names. Because the idea is that everybody's on the street. It's much more moral protest. This is why it's so difficult to make governments out of these protests. It's very powerful when you should say no, when you're going to overthrow somebody, but it's not easy to make a government and to govern with the support of the street because it's a very diverse group of people.
Masha, there were protests also in Russia this summer. Is it serious, or is it just nothing to mention very much?
Yeah, so I don't know if Russian protests actually fall in the same category, and I'd love to hear what you guys think, because I think that, I know that Russian protests are distinct from American protests. Right? And they're distinct in a couple of ways. One is that there are in no way collective action. Right? We're used to thinking of protests as forms of collective action, but Russian protests are individual action. They are, basically, it's usually Alexei Navalny, the anti-corruption activist, who will post a call for people to come out into the street on a particular day. And so people see that call on YouTube, they go out on that particular day, and they go home. There's no organizing that happens. There is no hashing out of what is going to be done. There's no, there's no group drawing up of banners. There's none of this stuff that has in the past gone with creating protest. And we've seen that change to some extent everywhere because of technology, right? But I think it's particularly extreme in Russia, which cracks down on any kind of collective action as soon as it appears. So all we have is this kind of individual action that has the outward appearance of collective action, but isn't that?
I think that, I was going to respond, I don't know about Russia, but I was going to respond to what you say. I think that there's been a real, what you're talking about, the four features, is a real fundamental change in the nature of what people assume democratic politics actually is. Yeah, I mean, Manuel Wallerstein liked to make the point that when you have a world revolution, you would say 1789, 1848, 1917, were all world revolutions. 1968 as well. When you have a world revolution, what it actually means is that there's a change in political common sense across the planet. And I think that what happened after the year of the squares, of the Arab Spring, of Occupy, is that nobody believes that a democratic revolution can happen or through institutional means. People assume that the institutions that exist are fundamentally corrupt, and democracy essentially means organizing outside them. I mean, you will have an influence on them, but you can't operate through them. Which is actually quite interesting if you think about it it's almost a change in class perceptions. It once occurred to me that what it means to be middle class, it's not really an economic category. It has to do with your relation to basic institutions. If you see a policeman and you feel more safe rather than less safe, you're probably middle class. But being middle class means that you believe that institutions should be working for you, whether it's government or the banking system, and therefore, if they're not, you're indignant. But in this case, nobody assumes these institutions really should be working for people like them anymore. And I think they're right.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the way that I've thought about it, and this again applies to both American and Russian protests, is that there's a kind of protest that is a negotiation with institutions. Like, you do this for me, you start paying attention to the AIDS epidemic and we'll go home. You end the war in Vietnam and we go home. You root out corruption in Russia and we go home. Right? You give us good governance, and we're going to go our separate ways. And then there's a kind of protest that is more, say the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, where get out of the presidential palace, right? We don't actually have a particular subject to negotiate with you. We all have different political agendas. But where we're united is that we have completely lost faith in the government that we have.
Just because for me, I agree very much that there is a fundamental change. But in a certain way, it's also quite important to see that many of these protests was also the way some of the authoritarian leaders managed to justify their rule. Because you don't have a revolutionary project, but you have the fear of the revolution in certain groups. For example, Mr. Erdogan, after having 2030 Gezi protests in Turkey, he goes and said, you see, these people means instability. These people has nothing to offer you. His famous statement, we are the people, who are you? So from this point of view, because also the crisis of democracy was not simply the crisis of people believing that they can influence the system, but also those in power didn't know how to justify their power. And then suddenly you have a threat. Russia, 2011, 2012, it was a regime change. But not exactly the way, basically totally. People asked for dignity, and they said, we want the dignity as individuals. And then Mr. Putin said, okay, let's get Crimea, so you're going to be dignified again. So from this point of view, I do believe this is something very important between these relations and dialectics between people's protest, who have the power to say no and to destroy, but we are not interested to go in power because they don't believe in power anymore. They don't believe in the state in the way they have been believing before.
By the way, David, I mean, I know you don't like that, but you are famous for many your books and texts, but also for that you are the author of this slogan, we are 99%. I know you say that it's a collective idea, but still.
I came up with the 99% part, but not the we and the are.
But you were the part of that Occupy Wall Street movement, which actually achieved nothing, did it?
That's completely false.
Yeah.
This is like the most idiotic, stupid propaganda, and I'm embarrassed to hear you repeat it.
Well, what do you really
No, I'm frankly, really.
Yeah, well,
I mean, everybody was trained to say this. Every single, during the entire campaign, we said we were not trying to achieve specific legislative aims. We're trying to create a cultural revolution. The moment that they shut us down militarily, basically, immediately every single commentator said, oh, they obviously failed because they didn't achieve specific legislative aims. We said from the beginning that's not what we were trying to do. At the moment, polls in America indicate that a majority of Americans under 30 consider themselves anti-capitalist. Where do you think they got that from?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Congratulations. I mean, yeah.
Nobody's ever managed to do that before.
No,
So the fact that everybody said fail, 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 it's because we were so successful, they're terrified.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, congratulations for that. I mean, that's yeah. It was coming to that. I mean, that's one of the typical phenomena of these mass demonstrations is there are many young people among them. Is it that what happened? Because there is I think there is a generation gap between, these young people and the rest of. Well, we are not baby boomers. We are a little bit younger, but still, there is a huge distrust or mistrust against this boomer generation born after 45, especially in West. So. What happened? Is this, again, a phenomenon which is new or not?
Which aspect?
The generation gap between...
Oh, God. Well, I mean, I don't want to hog all the attention. What do you think of this generation? Then I'll give my opinion.
I don't... first of all, let's, a couple of things. I think that while it's true that a lot of protesters are young, I also think that there's a kind of perceptual bias in favor of seeing young protesters, because every time we have a any kind of statistical data on the generation makeup of protesters, and we compare that to public perception, we compare that to newspaper coverage, and we compare that to pictures in the papers, we realize that protesters, by and large, are, on average, are older than than public opinion holds them to be. So I don't think, but at the same time, of course, there's no denying that there's a major worldwide youth movement that was born just in the last year, and which is the climate strike movement. And it's incredibly tempting to, even for an old person, to say, oh, we've never been through anything like this. This is completely new. I suspect that's not entirely true. I suspect that every period of social upheaval has seen an enormous generation gap. I've certainly read about that in books, even if I haven't experienced that personally. But I also, I look at my kids and I think that if ever there was a reason to distrust your parents and to resent your parents, they have it. I raised them in this period of endless consumption. And as they became sort of conscious, independent beings, they realized how destructive and how destructive to them personally and to their future that kind of upbringing was. I mean, I think that is a generational betrayal that we have perpetrated.
You have written a wonderful piece about Greta, Masha, about Greta and Trump. It was, by the way, translated, and you can find it on a website in translation in Slovak. Ivan.
I do believe the interesting story with the baby boomers was that they believed that they're the revolutionary generation. And as a result of it, paradoxically, you have, if 1968 was kids being totally angry at their parents, now you have parents totally angry at their kids.
The same people.
Yeah, the same people, yeah. Because in a
They're
certain
just
way,
an angry generation.
Because the kids are taking from them the most important. Their revolutionary biographies. And this is quite important because also I do believe that when I was talking about numbers, I really do believe that numbers matters. When you talk about the environmental issues, and I don't talk protests, but if you see how people are voting in places like Germany, CDU and the Greens are generational parties. This is the new grand coalition because paradoxically, the young people said, okay, we don't have the numbers, but we have the right to speak on behalf of those not born yet because you're threatening them. And this is funny because normally it was the conservatives speaking on behalf of those not born because of the abortion. And this is an important message. So you have two types of movements, but which is interesting. Both of them has an apocalyptic vision about the future. On one left, you have the right-wing populists who basically said, our way of life is destroyed. Nothing is remaining. And the young people said, life is destroyed. So from this point of view, I'm talking now Europe. I don't want to talk because I don't know much about other places. But the interesting story about Europe is there was a opinion poll being done all over Europe a year ago. 67% of the people believed that life was better before, including 52% of the people younger than 30. Of course, nobody knows when this before was. It was different for different people, but paradoxically, you have this nostalgic mood even of a young people. And here is the difference with 68. 68 young people go to the street and said, I do not want to live the life of my parents. Now many go on the street and said, I have the right to live the life of my parents.
Yeah, but they haven't because their future is much worse.
Absolutely,
And that,
okay.
Isn't that, David? I mean, the older generation just don't want to think about their children and grandchildren, about their future. Isn't that something new?
It's an incredibly nihilistic generation, I must say. I mean, I'm technically a baby boomer, kind of. I came just at the tail end, but I really think that generation will be remembered if there is a future history, which I am hoping there will be, as the most destructive that's ever been on this planet. If you think about it, it was the very people who were the sort of rebels of the late 60s who were rebelling against their parents, who then took away their parents' pensions and when they came into power across the world, and you know, are now in the process of screwing over their children and their grandchildren. What kind of a planet are they leaving them? And it really is a generational gap in America, at least, in terms of, I saw statistics that really startled me about the Tea Party versus Occupy. The average age of a Tea Partier was 53, and the average age of an Occupier was 19. Otherwise, the demographics were almost exactly the same. If you look at it politically in Great Britain, where I live now, someone figured out that if only people over 60 voted, there would be only conservative MPs in Parliament. If only people under 30 voted, there would be only Labour MPs in Parliament. It's that big a split. Yeah.
The good news is that the generational war is the only war we know how it's going to end up.
Yeah. But you can't blame them because, I mean, what do they have to look forward to? It's the first time in rich countries where you have a generation which is, you know, has much less chance of ever owning a house, has much less, whether they're going to have any kind of retirement is in question. Their chance of having a secure job and therefore having a family, I mean, they're postponing it constantly, is less and less. And they have to look forward to the possibility of complete climate disaster in 20 or 30 years.
Do you think that this climate crisis and this young generation maybe not movement still, but well, it is, but it's the energy of this, the anger of young people. Is it a hope or a threat?
Well, it's both. Don't you think? I mean, yeah. I mean, it's a threat that gets them mobilized, but the moment, I've been involved a little bit with the Extinction Rebellion in the UK. They have a whole process where you kind of move through grief to come out with hope. You know, first you have to envision the worst and realize that terrible things are going to happen. And once you internalize that and understand it, then you can hope. I mean, it's a whole generation is going through that process in one way or another.
Just coming to another thing, I mean, because all this symposium, this conference about the fear and public against fear and what are we scared of? Because we live in this country, I mean, so I can admit it, one of the fears I have is Russia. Masha and Ivan, you are one of the best people who know Russia, I mean, in deep. Should we fear them?
Well, it depends on what you mean.
I mean regime.
You know, this is a very tricky thing for me to talk about, not because I don't know how to think about it, but because, you know, I work at The New Yorker. I cover American politics for a living and a little bit of Russian politics. And I feel like I'm living through this insane sort of cheap replay of the Cold War and the Red Scare. And so, you know, so I have to place myself in that context before I start talking about how scary Putin is. And this is, you know, and it's an absurd place for me to be in because in 2012 I published a book about Putin in which I basically argued that that people weren't taking him seriously enough and weren't realizing how terrifying he was. And, you know, I find what has happened in Russia an absolutely terrifying outcome. And at this point, I think it's an outcome, right, which is a sort of the creation of this monster that has a mafia state on top and a totalitarian society at the base, right? A society that has reconstituted itself as a totalitarian society in the absence of a totalitarian regime, right? And I think that's absolutely terrifying. At the same time, you know, I then have to go back to my American colleagues and say, no, Russians did not elect Trump. Americans elected Trump. You know, it doesn't mean that Russians didn't want Trump elected. It doesn't mean that Russians don't have a vested interest in the outcome of the American election, as does the rest of the world, right? But but it's Americans who elect Trump. And any place I think you go in the West, while there can be greater and lesser sort of indicators of Russian influence, the greatest threat to any kind of democratic rule anywhere in the West is the population of that country, and not Russia.
I'm very, very close to where Masha is. There is really quite important to understand what we're talking about. First, of course, Russia is an awful place to live. And to be honest, if you're Russian citizens, you know that there are two things that you cannot choose: your parents and your president. This is not in the cards. But at the same time, I do believe that what we started to do is first using Russia as the way to avoid certain type of tough questions about our own societies. What is much more scaring about Russia is how in many respects Russia and the West starts to look the same. This is the scary part. And this cannot be explained only with the Russian covert operations, which are reality. There is no doubt about this. And the second thing which I am afraid of when we start basically talking too much about Russia is that this is the way to empower President Putin. Listen, if I believe the American media that Putin elected the American president, then the Bulgarian elections should be eliminated. If he can elect American president, I don't see any reasons why he cannot elect Bulgarian president or Slovak president. It should be much easier.
Come on.
So we created, we created out of Putin all this almighty person that is doing everything in the world. And this is scary in itself. Because honestly speaking, most of the people who talk about how powerful Russia is are people who have never been in Russia. There is no energy in Russia. China, in my view, is much more problematic, scary. You have technology, you have ambition. By the way, there is no Russia factor. There is a Putin factor. And from this point of view, it's very important when we talk not to come with the explanation that makes it easier for us to explain what we're not understanding in our own societies.
Dave, you have Russians in London where you live.
Yeah, we do a lot of them. Yeah, they're everywhere.
They're rich.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, Putin represents the scariest thing about Putin to me is he represents this kind of vision of, I call it post-apocalyptic authoritarianism. This is what it's going to look like where you have, after the world collapses, after an economic collapse, after an environmental collapse, nobody cares. It's a totalitarianism with no ideology. He doesn't believe in anything. It's just a criminal mafia. Yet, people accept that as an alternative to utter chaos, because they assume that's the only other thing there could be. And yes, in terms of the international influence, I find this very amusing because I do know Russians and who find the whole idea that Russian spies or these masterminds going around manipulating world events is hilarious because they know that Russian spies are completely incompetent and terrible. I mean, so bad that apparently their passports are sequentially numbered. You can actually figure out just by looking at them who they would be. They all went to the same high school. Anybody who's even vaguely competent would be able to know who these guys are and unmask them. And in a way, I sometimes wonder what it is in the sort of Western psyche where they need Russian spies. Everything else about the Cold War has largely gone away, but the Russian spies are still here. We're always going to have Russian spies. We're always going to be obsessing about them. Why? What do they represent in the American imagination? But
everything.
Yeah, it seems. But in the case of the U.S., it's very clear what the story is really about. It's that the Democratic Party establishment, the Clintonites, who essentially grabbed the nomination from the left on pretty suspicious grounds, but on the grounds that we are competent, we are the professionals, we're the guys who knew what we're doing. Then somehow managed to lose to Bozo the Clown. I mean, the most incompetent, idiotic politician who's ever run for president in America beat these guys. What are they going to say? I mean, any other reason they could give for why they lost would imply that the left-wing Party actually had a better strategy. The only way they can pull it to the right is say, no, it was Russian spies. It's just an excuse.
And one more sentence. One of the way we talk Russia so much is because we don't know how to talk China.
Yeah, sure. But there is another thing. I mean, of course, the Russia is not only about the spies. Russia is also about money and the corruption which is infiltrating our countries. And well, we should be blamed for that. But well, this country is totally, I mean, corrupted from bottom down. I mean, the bottom is much more corrupted than the down. But you are coming from US, you are coming from Britain, you are coming from Bulgaria. Now, well, talking about Austria, but there
Let's not go into a competition who is more corrupt.
Yeah. I mean, that
you can lose.
Yeah, I mean, corruption in Slovakia is a corruption of 5 million people, or the country of 5 million people. But the corruption in Britain or in America, I mean, it's a different scale, isn't it? I mean, it's not only about Russian money, but still the corruption is, I mean, that threat, isn't it?
You know, I just wrote an essay that's on the website right now about what we talk about when we talk about corruption in the impeachment hearings, right? Because I can count at least 4 or 5 uses of the word corruption, sometimes in a single paragraph. Distinct uses of the word corruption in a single paragraph in the impeachment hearings, which is very troublesome. But we're talking about post-Soviet corruption. We're talking about the kind of corruption that is a smear and a cudgel, in the sense that in a corrupt system, everyone is always somehow outside the law, which means that anybody can be eliminated by being accused of corruption. And that is actually a symptom of systemic corruption that is at the basis of the system, which is true, I think, of many post-Soviet countries, certainly true of Russia, but it's also true of how accusations of corruption have been instrumentalized by autocrats and aspiring autocrats, which is something that Trump has he took to it so fast. I mean, this is one of his. He's good at intuiting those kinds of instruments. At the same time, there's another kind of corruption that I didn't even write about yesterday, which is corruption that is endemic to the American system, that is not illegal, right? And it is not illegal. In fact, it is explicitly legal to have the entire political system constituted on the basis of financial contributions. The entire political system, right?
Which, by the way, this is what we were getting at when we coined the phrase the 1% and 99% and Occupy, is the 1% are not just the people who get all of the benefits of economic growth since 2008. They're also the people who make all the campaign contributions. So basically, they're people who can turn their wealth into power and their power back into wealth. And that's why we stayed out of the political system. It was essentially a system of institutionalized bribery. If you look at the corruption indexes, America always comes out at the bottom as one of the least corrupt countries in the world. And you look at that and say, what? And then you realize that, well, giving money to a politician to influence their vote isn't illegal in America. If you do that in Nigeria, that's illegal. So Nigeria is a corrupt country. If you do it in Russia, it's illegal. But it's not illegal in America.
Well, the audience might not know this, but this is, to me, one of the great examples. Whether you have access to primary debates in the United States is based on the amount of campaign contributions that you have collected. Your campaign will be disqualified
if you haven't got enough bribes.
If you haven't,
but here is also quite important, because coming from where I'm coming, I also know certain things about corruption. And the problem with the corruption is also that this is an empty signifier. You can attack for corruption anybody. Who is now fighting corruption most in the world? The Chinese leader, the Philippines leader. Mr. Lukashenko, by the way, started his career as an anti-corruption crusader. So if you have a political life which only debate is about corruption, this is a problem. I do believe corruption, our countries at least that I know, has a real corruption problem. But to fight them, we should talk about something more than corruption. Because otherwise you go to this vicious circle in which people stop trusting anybody, and we are giving power to the prosecutors and the police to basically save us from corruption. I don't know how it's in Slovakia, but I don't want basically the power to go to these institutions in order to believe that we are going to be a much more fair and just society.
Well, look what happened in Brazil. I mean, perfect example of that.
Yes, but, so what's wrong? I mean, the corruption, but we talk about, it's illegal corruption. So is that the Western civilization just went wrong?
Capitalism?
Well, what about that, David?
What about capitalism?
Capitalism.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing is whether the system we have can even be described that way anymore. It seems to be morphing into something else, which isn't actually better. Could in ways be worse. We have increasingly this kind of mix of the worst aspects of capitalism and some kind of managerial feudalism. If you look at the profits for most large corporations that are traded in the city and Wall Street and Frankfurt, they're no longer actually coming from commerce or industry at all. They're almost all from finance. Either they're financial companies or financial divisions of industrial companies. And that just means, they're just taking money directly from people. You can't even, it's impossible to even get the numbers for how much a family income, the average family income in a place like America or most European countries goes to the fire sector, to finance, insurance, and real estate. Increasingly, we have a system where people have just got the system rigged, so they're simply extracting money from you. And they call it capitalism, but it bears a tangential relationship to what they used to call capitalism back in the days when capitalism mainly meant making stuff.
The only thing that I found very difficult in this question is that in a certain way it's so big that, and the answer is right. But I do believe that the most difficult for the situation is that the thing that went wrong is also certain things that went right. So in a certain way, globalization, opening of the world, it's good.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, this is bad because all this became possible also because of it. And this is why it's so difficult to go with this question, what went wrong, because capitalism is wrong. What was the alternative? Before, for good or bad, you knew the alternative, you can compare. So in a certain way, I do believe that the most story is that probably in different places, different things went wrong. Obviously, there is a problem with the way capitalism is developing that was wrong. But if we stay on the level of the most abstract statement, I do believe that we are going into this apocalypse-friendly discourse in which basically nothing could be done.
Yeah.
Could be done something?
Well, lots of things could be done. I mean, I think we're supposed to be talking about imagination. It's always struck me that for the last 30 years, there has been a kind of war on the human imagination. The very idea that it would be possible to imagine a different social arrangements and bring them into being, even though that's what human beings have been doing in one form or another for thousands of years. We're told in thousands of very subtle ways that that's no longer possible. It's very strange because often it's said because of technology, right? I'm an anthropologist, so I'll often point out that, there's, endless variety of different economic systems have existed over human history. And people say, oh yeah, but that's all primitive stuff. That's all, in the past, that's not a modern economy. To which, the obvious response is, all right, you're saying if you've got an ox cart and you're carting around wheat, there's 100 different ways to arrange your economy, but if you have a high-speed computer, there's only one. That doesn't sound likely. I thought computers were supposed to give us more options. In fact, if all those people out there who are spending all their time coming up with new ways to do high-speed derivative trading, we're said, okay, have fun with it. Try to figure out a better way to distribute goods and services that, wouldn't destroy the planet and would be a little more equitable. I bet they come up with all sorts of things. You'd have 30 different models right away. It's not that people don't have ideas, it's that we have created a gigantic system to tell people to shut up all the time and stop thinking.
Yeah, well, I think Yeah, that's actually why, I mean, I think that's fantastic, all three of you, because they are imaginative and breaking the stereotypes. I mean, Masha, what is a stereotype you really think is now the burden in America or in Russia? I mean, a stereotype which you live in, and people are not able to get that this is not right.
Well, off the top of my head, I can give you an example that actually, this is something that I live through every spring. So every spring I teach a course on, basically an introductory media course for undergraduates. And in the middle of the course, after they have learned about the history of American media and all the many failed attempts at creating regulation and creating democratic media, I say, well, can you imagine a different way of thinking about media? Can you think about media as a public utility? Can we talk about media as a public good? And I always have a group of students, anywhere between 20 and 35 students, who mostly think of themselves as leftists, who recoil in horror at that point and say, no! And I said, well, why not? And they said, because it would be censorship. I'm like, wait a second. So if we entrusted the regulation of media to representatives or bodies constituted by an elected, accountable government, there would be censorship. Mm-hmm. But right now, when we entrust them to people who are accountable to no one but themselves, not even, at this point, not even shareholders, because the biggest single person with an influence on the American media scene is Mark Zuckerberg, who is accountable solely to himself, right? And that doesn't instill fear of censorship in you. And then it's always a very interesting conversation. I always manage to bring around maybe 3 to 5 people out of, between 20 and 35. So that's an example of a place where imagination has just been, trampled into the ground, with a couple of catchphrases that have something to do with vague ideas of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, and have nothing to do with the essence of those concepts.
Ivan.
Yeah, my story is even more simple, and because of this book with Holmes, we have been rereading all the statements and people trying to make sense of 1989 in the first 2 or 3 years. And there was one person who came extremely wise out of it. And for those of it who remember him, he's the most unexpected one. His name was Don Quayle. So Don Quayle was the vice president of the United States back then, and he was the big favorite of the American stand-up comedians because, but in 1990, he made the following, in my view, absolutely genius statement. He said, what we are witnessing today is an irreversible development towards more democracy and more freedom, but of course this could change. And I'm saying this because one of the things was that I see in our part of the world probably one of the worst things that we did. The idea to imitate the West was so strong that we made the idea of the experiments a dirty word. And we should experiment, because political imagination is not simply about having a new grand vision, but doing things differently. Just try to see. Probably they're going to fail too, but we're going to learn something. And if there is one thing that really scares me, this is some of the political imagination of the Silicon Valley. Because these people do not believe in small changes. See their hobbies. They can go to the moon. They can buy an island. All the time the idea is that we should start anew. Nothing can be done with the humanity in the way it is. For me, this is scary. And this is why I do believe we should make experiments. These experiments are not going to be necessarily wise. This experiment should not be on the national level and basically trying to make people what they are not. But as a result of it, we're going to rediscover the pleasure of a small political imagination. Because probably small political imagination is what is going to make us happier.
Well, but it's also isn't that in this country 30 years ago, I mean the communist regime collapsed and nobody expected that, I mean, the 2 years later, actually the state collapsed because the Czechoslovakia stopped to exist. So we should have actually know that that collapse is possible. The problem is that, I mean, you talk about small changes, but those who think big, well, actually, I am scared of that they will bring the world to the collapse. Are we afraid of collapse, and is it possible?
Talking about fear, I have a great statistics that you're going to love. I don't know why, but in the year 1988, there was a study of what different nations in the world fear. And it appeared that in 1988, Americans were fearing communism, Russians were fearing war, and the Yugoslavs were fearing snakes. You know that it ended worse for the people who feared snakes. So from this point of view, we should be also in charge of our fears.
Okay, so give us hope, David. The collapse can be creative, or what?
Well, collapse. Actually, what I was thinking, you know, we are in a situation where there is going to be ecological collapse unless we start using our imaginations very, very quickly. And the remarkable thing is the people who seem to feel that the mature thing to do is to do nothing in the face of an oncoming train. It's extraordinary. You know, at the moment, imagination is pretty much the only thing that's going to save us. And we've been so taught that this is impossible, that even when we see it right in front of our nose, we can't believe it's happening. We say it isn't. The example I love to give is what's happening right now in northeastern Syria, where you have in Rojava. I mean, I've been there a couple times, and I witnessed that you have, you know, a feminist revolution happening right in the middle of the Middle East. You have people creating directly democratic councils, all these crazy educational experiments, social experiments, political experiments, and nobody seems to know. I have a lot of friends who are Kurds who just can't believe it, because you talk to people about it, and it's like, you know, it's like water off a duck. I mean, it just slips off them. They can't believe it's happening, so they just listen to you. Oh, that's interesting. And just walk on as if you didn't say it. We've been taught that any sort of real, meaningful social transformation is simply impossible. So if people are saying it is, you know, either they're lying or you just forget it happened 5 minutes later. But there are people all over the world who are in act beginning to do this. You know, whether it's in Chiapas and northern Syria and places we don't even know about. I lived in Madagascar for a couple of years in a place which was essentially free of all state control, where people were creating new institutions. They were smart enough not to tell anybody, so nobody knows about it. You know, I mean, sometimes the last thing you should do is put up a flag and say, ha ha ha, we are independent. You know, then somebody's going to come and kill you. But if you don't say it, nobody's going to notice. They're in Madagascar, right? And so things like that are happening all over the place, but we're taught not to see them. We're taught to feel that these, just me. We're taught to feel they're impossible.
And
It's not
you know,
simply
literally
we don't
not
see
hear
them, we don't hear them.
On the other hand, I mean, isn't it also so that the people have already feeling the collapse is here? Because, I mean, everything has changed. I mean, in U.S. seems to be like collapsing country. I mean, how is it? I mean, is that the feeling of the collapse there?
You know, I mean, I don't know what. Okay, I am feeling collapse. Yes. You know, I don't know. I don't know what the chicken and egg relationship here is. I know that we live in an age, and this is not the first time, not even the first time in 100 years, that we're living through an age of overwhelming anxiety globally, right? And we know that periods like this empower leaders that Eric Fromm called magic helpers, who promise to take you back to the imaginary past, which of course has a lot to do with how even young people believe that that things were better before, in whatever before there, this magic helper is promising to transport them to. What is primary here? The anxiety, or this rush to hand over agency? What constitutes collapse? I think it's the anxiety that constitutes collapse.
There was an interesting story. There is a Bulgarian fiction writer, which probably you know, because I do believe he was translated in Slovak, Georgi Gospodinov. And he's working on a novel, and the plot of the novel is the following. European leaders cannot agree about the future, so they decided to agree that we should go back to the past. But the problem is that we should decide in the 20th century which is the year in which we want to go together. Bulgarian, Germans, others. And we have been talking about this. I don't know what's going to happen in his novel. It's going to be more interesting than what I'm going to tell you. But when I start seriously thinking about this, is there an year in which we all can go together? Paradoxically, it's only 1989, because the hopes were highest everywhere. And from this point of view, this is what you're maximizing. You're maximizing hopes. Of course, in Poland, there was a very difficult year when it comes to the economy and so on, but the hopes were highest. And there is an interesting way to measure this energy. The figure that I'm never going to forget is in 1981, the top year of solidarity, consumption of alcohol in Poland was reduced 4 times. So people were really so much basically drunken with the political energy that they stopped drinking. No, but there is not a joke here. This is incredible. 4 times for 1 year is incredibly high. And I do believe this is what we're talking about, how you're maximizing hope.
I'll give you another statistic that I love. In Russia has been suffering from technically inexplicable excess mortality for the entire post-war period, with the exception of 2 short periods, the Khrushchev thaw and the Gorbachev perestroika.
Well, David tried to silence that by very imaginative way. He took off the battery. Now you just try to put... No, you shouldn't, because it's probably because of it's close to this machine or whatever.
I was holding up here. I was doing
well, okay, so then you can... what strikes me is that these new authoritarian types of politicians who are corrupted and populists are in the same way human rights and the rights of people of minorities and various whatever orientation and ethnic identity. Is it also something which, because communists were not like that very much. I mean, they were at least internationalists in the same that they were nationalists, but I didn't think they were so oppressive. Were they?
Yes, they were.
Against
minorities, yeah, absolutely.
But why it is, yes, sure, but they were oppressive against everybody somehow. Well, my question is why it is so that these populists are so much against LGBT people and other minorities. Why it is so?
Yeah, I don't think it's any great mystery. I think that because the promise at the basis of this politics is the return to an imaginary past, they need to at least promise to reverse the most rapid social change of the last generation, and that has been an LGBT politics. Putin is, as often happens, the most vivid example, because he really basically has been saying, if you want to go back to a time when you felt comfortable and nothing made you uncomfortable and foreign values weren't forced down your throats, then we just have to get rid of the queers because they were imported from the West. We didn't have any gay people before 1991. Which is kind of true. Because there were certainly people who had sex with people of the same sex, but there weren't people who claimed an identity, who claimed that it was a political identity, who claimed that there were rights that accrued to them because of this identity. So you can say, okay, all of those things, are the result of the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of our time, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if we just get rid of the gays, everything is going to go back to normal. We're basically seeing a lighter version of that all over the Western world, because that's the social change of the last generation. And, there's a rational grain to this, because, of course, and I was thinking about this when Ivan was saying, what is the year that we could all agree to go back to? Well, I'm not so sure about 1989, right? Like, for me, that was just not a great time to be a queer person. Everybody was dying of AIDS, and nobody, and LGBT people had no rights anywhere except Scandinavia. So, groups of people who really don't want to go back to the past with you are your enemy.
I very much agree, but there is two more elements. One is demographic. The fear of shrinking majorities. So you have the majority groups, which basically are losing the number. And I do believe this is particularly strong. Not only Putin. You're going to see also in many of our countries. You walk around and said, where are our kids? And you're blaming basically this type of social changes for this. And secondly, not simply where our kids, but why our kids are not our kids anymore. Why we don't understand them. The West basically has kidnapped our kids. They speak the language we don't understand. They talk about things that we don't understand. And it's not about politics. It's about social norms, because the social norms change extremely hard in 30 years. For example, if you go on the opinion polls, you're not going to see in Eastern Europe a major differences between the young people and old people when it comes to anti-migration sentiment. But you're going to have a lot of changes when it comes to the sexual minorities. And I do believe this is also part of it. The demography is something that we don't know how to talk about, but demographic imagination is critically important to understand also this new wave of authoritarianism. This is the fear of shrinking numbers.
I have a kind of a, for me, surprising everyday experience is that not only as a journalist, but also because I'm on the social networks and so on, I am bombarded by the hatred. But when you walk in the city, you see people who look happy, and they are nice, and they are very even polite. What is the gap between the people's minds and those who are living here around us? I mean, what is it? Don't you have the same experience? I mean, it's weird that if you go in the city, it's nice. But if you look in the people's minds, it's just horror.
I don't have the same experience because I don't have social media.
Yeah, that's...
But what I do believe is important is the following. Even if you go, I'm talking now only Eastern Europe, I don't. If you go on the opinion polls, 70% of the people in places like Poland and others, they're going to see that individually they're satisfied with their life. But the idea is of a kind of a fear of a collective failure. I'm doing fine, but the world is not doing well. My country is not doing well. And this is part of the fact that you don't know exactly the world is going. You're losing kind of the sense that you know what is happening. And from this point of view, this is very strange, because I'm not going to call it fear. This is anxiety. Fear is when you exactly know what you fear. And by the way, fear is a disciplining kind of a sentiment. I was talking to a colleague who was doing some work in the Russian high security prisons among Voroy Zakonia. This is a kind of a very senior criminals. And do you know, this is very polite people when they talk to each other, because the words matter. You cannot swear because the other person simply should kill you. He does not have an option because it's a reputation issue. When people are so vocal, when people so easily go on a kind of hate words, it's much more anxiety. You know that you are not in control of what is going on. You don't know what it is. Is it good? What is bad? So this is not the fear where I know I fear you. And then I'm very careful what I'm saying. I'm very strategic exactly because I fear you. Anxiety is, in my view, producing so much noise and hatred.
Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was talking about anxiety before, and I think that anxiety is also, anxiety is an instrument of control on a par with terror, right? Anxiety keeps you from being able to think clearly. Anxiety certainly kills the imagination. Anxiety prevents you from planning for the future beyond tomorrow, if that, right? Anxiety is what basically makes a person a minimally functioning member of society, somebody who will go to work and come home and watch television and get drunk, but will never cause trouble. And I think anxiety is sort of the instrument par excellence of our age, and this is exactly why when you turn on Russian television, you will see people screaming at each other constantly. I mean, every Russian talk show is a screaming match, and this is state-controlled television. And it is, you can watch the state manufacture of anxiety on a daily basis.
Yeah. America is not much different. The last time I came back there, I was just shocked when I turned on, some of the cable networks, and people were just like shouting their heads off. It's like, calm down. Jeez, what's the matter with you people? The standards of discourse had just completely changed even in the 10 years that I'd really been paying attention. No, I totally agree with you about anxiety. I think French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu did a study of how job insecurity affects politics. That essentially, the first thing that happens when you no longer have secure employment is you stop political participation. Because you don't know if you're even going to live here, in 5 years. So he made the argument that there was an intentional move to create precarious conditions in order to depoliticize people. But insofar as those people get repoliticized, well, we've seen how.
I have there are a couple of minutes still left for the questions from the audience. I believe you have the questions. It's up to you, because otherwise, of course, I have a lot of them. But there are any hands there? Here they are. Yeah, the first one there, left. And do you have microphones? Do we have microphone? Do anybody has a microphone? If not, I have to give it. No. I mean, I wanted to give the microphone the left. I mean the.
Могу спросить по-русски? Можете говорить?
Не, говорите просто по-словенски, это приложим.
Пожалуйста, как понимается сегодня в России демократия? Могут русские люди делать то, что хотят? Поэтому я помню еще за Горбачева, что было запрещено, и коррупция была, и сегодня могут люди в России и в бывших республиках Советского Союза делать, что хотят. Спасибо.
Thank you.
One question. And what about democracy in Great Britain? Thank you very much.
Okay, so you have two questions. I mean, the other people actually in Russia free to speak, and is there any kind of democracy, Masha?
Right. So, well, first of all, I'd like to distinguish between democracy and the freedom to do what you want. I think democracy is the government of the governed. This is something that empirically we do not have in Russia. Different people have different amounts of power and ability to do what they want. But that is a function of not having a democracy.
So, David, is there any democracy in Great Britain?
There are some bits, yes. I mean, we're going to see. In Great Britain, there is enormous media control. It's really quite remarkable. About, out of 18 newspapers, I think 16 of them have the same political position. The BBC has largely been silenced, very self-consciously. Anytime people I know who go on BBC are often, even musicians and people like that, the first thing they say is, don't criticize the ruling party, we're coming up for funding review. So there's been, they also have D-notices, things where you actually literally tell people, stop talking about that, you're not allowed to talk about that on TV anymore. Freedom of speech is limited. You can say whatever you like on a soapbox. You can say whatever you like, to your friends, which is great, But I think people, they've learned very strategic methods of silencing. Social media, on the other hand, is lively. So it's a mixed bag in that regard. It's never been a completely democratic system. but it has significant democratic elements. I think the same could be said of America. America, of course, the system was never designed to be democratic. I always point out that nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution does it say anything about America being a democracy. The people who wrote those documents were against democracy and said so all the time. They wanted a republic. And in fact said they were creating an institution to prevent the danger of democracy. However, within about 50 years, it was relabeled democracy, and there's been a struggle internally in the US over how democratic it should be ever since. For a while it was moving forwards, now one might argue it's moving backwards.
So there was another question. I can give you.
Thank you. My name is Braňo, and my question is for you to give advice to Slovakia or Slovak politics. And I would say that it's easy to be a populist, and we see this around the whole world. You can promise anything to your voters, they don't have to pay taxes, you get everything for free, and you get elected, you get lots of votes. But if you're a responsible politician, how do you get lots of votes? How do you beat the politics while you're telling the people that you need to do hard things like paying the taxes and so on and so on? So how do you win in elections while you do responsible politics? And we have elections coming in 4 months, so thanks for advice.
Thank you very much. This is a good question, so give us advice, please. Who wants to start?
My mother told me that if I really want to do something good to people, is not to give them advices. But there is one thing which is true. Listen, there is so many words being said by populist, not populist, that people stop trust words. People start to trust people. And this is always kind of the motion in which you don't know how institutions go, but it's very much about the trust, and this trust comes from the biography of the people, how you feel it. So from this point of view, the populist has their moment. But we are now living in a post-populist situation, to be honest, because it's easy to be a populist when you have never been in government. And from this point of view, I do believe that we should not overestimate the power of the empty demagogic politics, because this is something more than this. And even Slovakia, at least I'm not a specialist to Slovakia and so on, but people, when they were voting for president, they voted for a person. And it was very much about trust. It was not about this promise or that promise or ideology. And I do believe one of the major mistakes of many parties was to believe that the program is enough. Program is never enough. You either trust people who are going to do it, or you can make a program now with algorithm. You can go based on the opinion polls and then come with a program that is going to fit every boxes of what people expect. This is not enough to be elected.
You know, I think that the problem with what we call populism, which I'm also not happy with that word for all sorts of reasons, but what we have come to call populism is not just anti-government, it is that, but it's also fundamentally anti-political, right? If politics is a conversation about how we live together in a country or a city or a planet, then the kind of politics that we're talking about is anti-political. It's against that conversation. It's a refusal to have that conversation. And I think the conversation actually still holds incredible appeal. I think that the mistake certainly that American Democratic Party politicians make is that they believe in technocracy. They don't believe in politics. They believe that they are running for best manager, and they go on television to say, I will be better at putting out fires and balancing the books, but they're not running for fireman, and they're not running for chief accountant. They're running for storyteller-in-chief. They're running for the conversation leader. I don't know enough about Slovak politics to give direct advice, and anyway, I don't think it's a journalist's job to do that. But I think this is my diagnosis of the problem with the political situation in the United States, and if that's at all useful, then please use it.
Well, it's a little odd to ask an anarchist to give advice to politicians. I could give all sorts of advice, but you could probably guess what it would be. But if I were to have to do so, I would say that I would disagree that it's all about personality and trust. I mean, they want it to be about that, but that's essentially a depoliticizing move. They're saying that politics is over. I don't think politics is over. I think that populism arises because of the frustration with people constantly being told that politics is over. I mean, if you look at what happened with Obama and Trump, Obama ran as a visionary. I mean, hope, change, all those sort of dreamy-looking posters. In a way, he represents the utter death of visionary politics, right? Because he ran as the kind of guy who would have a vision, and it never even occurred to people to ask what that vision was, you know, which turned out to be nothing, personal power. So he ruled as a technocrat. And people were so angry and felt so betrayed and frustrated that they sort of took this utter nihilistic reaction to that. Now, don't make the same mistake, you know? I mean, if you're going to present yourself as somebody who believes in something, find something you actually believe in. And you know, it's not that hard. They must believe in something. And if you don't really believe in anything, stop being a politician.
Well, Masha was talking about how important the conversation is, and I agree, but that it's easy to have a conversation with people like you, and because it was such a pleasure. And I have to end it because it's time, so I just enjoyed it very much. I hope you did too. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.